The smell of frying meat drifted across the clearing, long before the soldiers realized how far it traveled in the humid Luzon air. It mingled with the sharp tang of burned foliage and the faint metallic scent of spent cartridges, reminders of the fight that had only just faded. Near the edge of the American Field Hospital, beneath a canvas tent patched with 3 shades of olive drab, a line of griddles hissed as cooks flattened small rounds of beef, coaxing them into meals, meant mostly for weary troops who hadn't tasted fresh food in days. The rescued girls sat in a tight cluster, wrapped in coarse army blankets, their posture stiff from habit rather than strength. The Americans didn't know their names yet, only that they had been pulled from a Japanese garrison, crushed between converging platoons of the 38th Division. The youngest looked barely 15, though exhaustion hollowed her features. The eldest might have been 22, her hands folded so tightly it seemed she was bracing for a command that no longer existed. Private Sam Whitmore, carrying a tray of steaming patties, slowed as he passed them. He had seen the outpost where they were found, a concrete blockhouse half collapsed under shelling, its rooms cramped, its air heavy with sickness. Nothing there had prepared him for how small the girls looked now, bundled like fragile survivors of a storm. He hesitated, unsure whether approaching them was wise, until one of the nurses motioned him forward. Corporal Evelyn Hart, sleeves rolled high and face smudged with sweat and dust, crouched beside the girls. She smiled gently, though her eyes betrayed the fatigue of triage after days of fighting. She had been the first to notice how the smell of meat made the girls tense, how their breathing shifted as if bracing for punishment rather than nourishment. When she reached for one girl's hand, the girl flinched before forcing herself still. "It's all right," Hart murmured, unsure if the words meant anything to them, but offering them anyway. She guided a cup of warm broth toward the oldest girl. The girl touched it to her lips, blinking rapidly at the rising steam, and took a hesitant sip. Her throat worked carefully, her body trembling as though the simple heat was unfamiliar. From the griddle line, spoons clicked against metal trays, harmless to American ears, but sharp to the girls. Each clang seemed to echo with memories they dared not share. Their shoulders twitched at unpredictable intervals, reflexes trained under threat. Lieutenant Graves, overseeing the kitchen detail, signaled Whitmore. "Take a couple to them," he said, nodding toward softer patties layered with bread. "Small portions. No onions." Whitmore nodded and carried 2 plates toward the cluster. The girls studied the food with wary eyes. The patties glistened in the tropical heat, cheese softening against the warm bread. Whitmore knelt, lowering the plates gently, as though afraid the slightest abrupt motion would frighten them. The youngest girl reached first, brushing 2 fingertips against a slice of bread. She glanced at Whitmore, uncertain, seeking permission without words. He gave a small encouraging nod. She lifted the bread to her mouth, paused as the scent reached her rich, warm, impossibly different from the thin rations she had known. Her breath hitched. Hart noticed immediately. She shifted closer, but before she touched the girl, tears began sliding down the child's cheeks. The girl pressed her fist to her mouth, as if trying to contain the sound, but the emotion escaped in trembling waves. The others followed, their tears rising from places deeper than hunger. The field hospital quieted as medics turned, bewildered. Cooks paused mid-motion. The air changed, heavy with a grief that few present understood. Whitmore's voice cracked as he whispered, "What did I do?" Hart shook her head. "You offered kindness," she said softly. "They don't know how to hold that yet." The eldest girl clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. She swallowed a bite of the sandwich placed before her, but the gesture triggered another sob. Breadcrumbs fell across her lap as she bowed her head, letting the emotion pour out unrestrained. Hart moved gently among them, offering touches only when welcomed. She didn't promise safety or had taught her not to make such fragile claims, but she offered presence, something steady, human. Graves approached quietly. "We'll need interpreters," he said to Whitmore. "Their reaction? There's more behind it." Whitmore nodded, eyes fixed on the girls. The scent of frying meat drifted in again, a reminder that the world outside their suffering kept turning. loud and indifferent. But for the girls, time had fractured. The simple act of receiving food without threat had cracked something inside them, something they had kept sealed to survive. Their tears weren't weakness. They were released. Heart rose slowly, feeling the emotional shift settling over them. They're crying because the war is ending for them, she whispered. And they don't know what comes after. For a long moment, none of the Americans spoke. The soldiers who only hours earlier had braved machine gun fire now stood helpless before a grief they could not bandage or splint. A medic stepped forward with extra blankets, unsure why, only knowing he needed to do something. Another cook lowered the flame on a griddle, as if softening the sound might soften the memory it stirred. In that brief hush, the camp felt strangely suspended, caught between violence that had passed and healing that struggled to emerge. Even the jungle seemed quieter, as though listening, and as another breeze carried the scent of frying meat toward her. She seemed to brace for a truth she had never imagined. That kindness, too, demanded courage. In this moment, the interviews began only after the girls stopped trembling long enough to sip broth without spilling it. The sun had shifted toward late afternoon, sending long slanted beams across the hospital clearing. And with each passing minute, the Americans realized how little they understood about the quiet group sitting beneath their canvas shelter. Lieutenant Graves ordered a messenger to fetch interpreters from a nearby civil affairs post. But even before the specialists arrived, fragments of truth leaked through gestures, glances, and the unmistakable language of fear. Corporal Evelyn Hart watched the girls carefully, noting how their shoulders tightened whenever bootsteps approached, how their eyes followed each soldier with the wary precision of people conditioned to anticipate danger. She moved slowly among them, her touch featherlight, guiding them to rest in a patch of shade. She sensed a story behind their silence, one that would not emerge easily, because trauma never rose like a clear tide. It seeped. Private Sam Whitmore lingered a few steps away, replaying the moment when a simple cheeseburger had triggered an emotional collapse. He had expected relief or hunger, perhaps gratitude, but not tears so raw they seemed to draw breath from the entire camp. He tightened his jaw, wrestling with the gnawing question of what horrors had taught them to fear kindness. The girl who seemed oldest noticed his troubled stare and lowered her gaze, as though apologizing for emotions she could not control. Whitmore immediately looked away, hating the idea that she felt responsible for anything after what she had endured. By the time two interpreters arrived, one, a Korean-American sergeant from the counterintelligence corps, the other, a Filipino civilian with patchy Korean vocabulary, the evening insects were already humming along the tree line. The interpreters knelt before the girls, speaking softly, taking care not to crowd them. Words exchanged haltingly at first, then with growing urgency as the connection deepened. The oldest girl's voice, barely above a whisper, cracked when she began recounting how soldiers had taken her from a village outside Kiju in 1942. She paused often, swallowing hard, as though each memory cut her throat from within. Hart kept her hands folded tightly while listening to the interpretation. The account painted a world no field manual had prepared her for. The girl described a transport ship crowded with young women, a stench of sweat and fear wrapping around them as guards barked orders. From Busan to Taiwan, then onward to the Philippines, the journey had blurred into cycles of sickness, hunger, and helplessness. Several girls had disappeared during the voyage. She didn't know whether they were dead or simply taken elsewhere. The interpreters delivered these details with neutral tones, but their eyes betrayed the effort of forcing each word into English. Whitmore felt himself drawn nearer, compelled by a quiet instinct to witness whatever truth the girls were brave enough to reveal. Another girl, younger and thin as a sparrow, described the comfort station, a dim concrete room whose walls trap heat so fiercely it felt like a punishment. She spoke of ration bowls barely filled, of beatings delivered without warning, of days when the only sign of passing time was the shift in the guards' voices. She mentioned how each night she tried to remember the sound of her mother's sewing needle, the one steady rhythm she once believed would never leave her. The interpreter's voice faltered translating that line. The Americans listened, stunned not by the violence. War had taught them plenty about cruelty, but by the isolation pressed into every detail. The girls had lived in a world where comfort meant vulnerability, where food meant obligation, and where silence offered the only form of resistance. It explained why the scent of frying meat, so ordinary to the soldiers, had carried such emotional weight for them. It represented a meal not tied to coercion, an act of nourishment given without price. More stories followed, each adding layers to the quiet devastation the girls carried. They spoke of officers destroying records as the Americans advanced, burning ledgers and correspondence in frantic attempts to erase evidence. They described retreating guards who grew more violent with desperation, striking the girls for imagined slights, convinced they would soon face defeat. One girl recalled hiding beneath a collapsed section of roof during an artillery strike, praying the chaos above would wipe away the entire compound. When freedom finally came, delivered by American boots and gunfire, she had not dared to believe it. As the interpreters relayed these confessions, the Americans' earlier confusion hardened into resolve. The central conflict became clear. The girls were not merely victims in need of food and shelter. They were survivors of a system designed to erase their humanity. The medics realized they weren't just treating malnutrition or infection. They were confronting a legacy of deliberate cruelty that would not dissolve with warm meals or clean bedding. Hart's breath trembled as she wrapped a fresh blanket around the youngest girl. Noticing how the child steadied herself by clutching the edge of the fabric like a lifeline, Whitmore felt an ache rising behind his ribs. He wished he could promise the girls that everything would be different now, that no one would ever hurt them again, but the war still raged across the islands, and he had learned the futility of false assurances. Instead, he offered the smallest genuine gesture he could. He sat down in the dirt beside them, leaving a respectful distance, making himself simply present. The oldest girl glanced at him, and for the first time since her rescue, did not look away immediately. Night crept slowly across the camp, settling into the spaces between tents, softening the edges of the turmoil the girls had dredged up. The cooks extinguished their stoves one by one, though the faint scent of meat still lingered, clinging to the air like a reminder of the moment that had opened this fragile path toward truth. Hart realized that understanding the girls' past was not enough. The Americans now carried a responsibility to protect their future. Just as the interpreters prepared to end the session, the oldest girl spoke again, her voice trembling but firm. She said there was something in the garrison the Americans had not yet found, something hidden beneath a floorboard in the room where they had been held. The interpreters exchanged uneasy glances before translating her words. Hart felt her stomach tighten. Whitmore leaned forward, sensing the shift. "It is a list," the girl said through the interpreter. "Names, places, many girls." The clearing fell silent, the soft night breeze brushing against them like a breath before a revelation. The Americans realized they were no longer dealing with isolated suffering. They were standing at the edge of a truth larger, darker, and far more dangerous than they had imagined. The search for the hidden list began at first light, when the camp was still quiet enough for whispers to carry. Lieutenant Graves sent a small team to the ruined garrison with the oldest girl as their guide, while the rest of the rescued women remained under Corporal Evelyn Hart's care. Private Sam Whitmore stayed behind too, uneasy about letting the girls vanish from sight again, even for a few hours. He watched the departing team disappear into the tree line, the girl walking stiffly between two medics, and felt a hollow ache in his chest, a fear that the world had already taken too much from her. Hart sensed his worry, but said nothing. She shared it. She moved gently among the remaining girls, offering water and soft bread, careful not to overwhelm them. Each girl ate slowly, as if still adjusting to the simple truth that food could arrive without cruelty attached. When the search party returned, the hidden list was clutched in Graves' hand folded, sweat-stained ledger sheet marked with Japanese characters. The paper smelled faintly of mold and dust. The Korean-American interpreter took it immediately, reading each line with a growing heaviness. It contained names, ages, and rough place-of-origin notes, all written in cold, mechanical strokes. Some entries were crossed out, others smudged beyond recognition. The interpreter exhaled shakily and said the list documented not only the girls rescued here, but dozens more sent to different stations across Luzon. The moment the translation reached Hart's ears, she felt the world narrow to a single point. This piece of paper carried the weight of countless unseen lives. The girls watched the Americans' reactions carefully, confusion flickering in their eyes. They recognized the document, but they didn't understand its significance to the soldiers. So Hart knelt beside them and asked the interpreter to explain. As the translation unfolded, the girls exchanged quiet, startled glances. Some looked relieved, proof that they had existed beyond the walls that confined them. Others seemed haunted, as though hearing their own names spoken from a foreign mouth made their suffering feel painfully real again. The youngest girl tugged lightly at Hart's sleeve, whispering something through trembling lips. The interpreter translated. She feared that now the Americans knew everything. They might send them away or treat them differently. Hart shook her head quickly, her voice gentle but firm, as she insisted the truth only deepened the Americans' responsibility. Whitmore stepped forward, studying the girls with a mixture of tenderness and sorrow. He asked the interpreter to help him ask a question. Why had the girls cried when given food? The answer that returned was halting but devastating. The oldest girl explained that the smell of meat had reminded her of the rare times the guards ate well while the girls starved. Bread, too, had been rationed as a reward or withheld as punishment. And kindness, true kindness, had been absent for so long that receiving it without price felt unbearable. As she spoke, the other girls nodded, their eyes shining with unshed tears, their voices emerging one by one, forming a fragile chorus of shared memory. These testimonies did not come out smoothly. They broke in uneven lines, revealing a life shaped by coercion so all-encompassing that even ordinary sensations carried the weight of trauma. The camp fell into a hush as the interpreters continued translating. Hart, listening to every word, felt each confession lodge itself in her chest. She saw how the girls' faces shifted with each revelation, as though finally speaking their truth offered a small yet unmistakable release. Whitmore, standing beside her, felt the same pull of emotion, the same dawning understanding that their tears over a cheeseburger had been far more than hunger. The moment felt like a lantern lifted in a darkened room. Each testimony illuminated a new corner, revealing how deeply the girls' identities had been shaped by fear, silence, and forced obedience. But amid the sorrow, a misunderstanding surfaced. One of the medics, not thinking, asked the interpreter whether the girls were Japanese. The interpreter repeated the question to the group, and confusion rippled among them. The oldest girl stiffened, shaking her head emphatically. They explained they were Korean taken by Japanese forces, not serving them willingly. A cold, sharp tension filled the air as the girls realized the Americans might have misread their origins, their experiences, even their loyalties. Hart felt panic rising among them and moved quickly to reassure them, kneeling so her eyes met theirs. She spoke carefully, asking the interpreter to clarify that the Americans knew they were victims, not collaborators. The relief that followed was subtle but noticeable, their shoulders lowering, their breathing easing by degrees. Graves, recognizing the weight of this revelation, stepped closer. He stated plainly that their identities mattered, that their voices mattered, and that this fragile sheet of paper would help protect them. The interpreter conveyed his solemn tone with precision. One girl, who had spoken little until now, whispered that no one had ever preserved her name before. She had expected to vanish, lost to time. Whitmore felt something inside him fracture at that admission. He crouched beside her, smoothing the dirt with his boot, and said through the interpreter that she would not disappear again, not while they were here. The emotional atmosphere shifted slowly, like the tide pulling away from a scarred shoreline. The girls began asking their own questions. What would happen next? Where they would go? Whether they would ever see home again? Hart answered as best she could, explaining the process of civilian repatriation, though she tempered every hope with honesty. She refused to offer false certainty, knowing trust grew only from truth. Whitmore added his own assurances when appropriate, careful never to overstep. Their combined presence, steady, patient, unthreatening, became a kind of anchor the girls clung to. As dusk approached and the sky deepened into violet, The interpreters prepared to conclude the session. The air grew cooler, settling soft shadows around the tent. The girls looked calmer, though exhaustion lined their faces. Hart noticed one of them quiet, withdrawn for most of the day, now studying the Americans with a look not of fear, but of hesitant curiosity. It was the first sign of something like hope. Just as the interpreters began packing their notebooks, the oldest girl spoke again, her gaze fixed on Graves. Her voice carried a trembling certainty that made everyone still. She said there was another room in the garrison one the Americans had not entered. And what lay inside, she whispered, was not a list, not a record, but something left behind in the chaos of retreat. Something the Japanese had not managed to burn. Something the girls believed the Americans needed to see. The second room in the garrison yielded its truth before dawn. Graves returned with a small wooden chest, wrapped in cloth scorched at the edges, its hinges half melted, as though someone had tried and failed to destroy it in a hurry. Inside lay medical logs, fragments of correspondence, and a scattering of photographs stained with moisture and ash. The interpreters examined each piece carefully, translating in low, steady voices. The documents confirmed what the list had only hinted at. The comfort station was part of a larger network spanning the islands, shuffled along retreat routes as Japanese forces collapsed. It wasn't merely evidence. It was testimony preserved by accident. Hart felt a tremor move through her as she held one charred page between her fingers. The girls had lived these records. Now the world could no longer deny them. The knowledge weighed on the Americans differently. Graves saw strategy proof that could inform intelligence briefings. Whitmore saw faces girls who had survived the cruelty inked into those pages. Hart felt something deeper, a solemn responsibility that stretched far beyond military duty. When she returned to the tent, she found the girls awake, huddled in silence, waiting. They looked at her with the tentative hope of people who expected punishment for speaking truth. Instead, she knelt among them and said softly that what they had shown the Americans would help many others. The oldest girl covered her eyes, exhaling a shudder that carried weeks, months, years of held breath. Over the next several days, the camp shifted around the girls as though learning to breathe with them. Medics created a quiet corner for their recovery, stringing a sheet to offer shade and privacy. Soldiers who passed nearby lowered their voices instinctively. The cooks prepared rice porridge, soft vegetables, and gentle broths alongside military rations. Even the sound of the griddle, once so sharp, so startling, seemed less intrusive now, though the scent of frying meat still made the girls pause before they remembered where they were. The girls changed too, subtly, in ways that revealed both fragility and flickers of resilience. The youngest began humming softly, off-folding her blanket, a melody cracked with hesitance, yet carrying the shape of something once familiar. Another girl started asking Hart questions about the nurses' uniforms, touching the white armband as though testing whether cloth could signify safety. The oldest allowed herself to sit with her back uncovered, no longer guarding the wall behind her. These small shifts created a tender rhythm of progress, each gesture a quiet declaration that they were re-entering the world on their own terms. Whitmore's they could not name. Yet the Americans stayed patient. Whitmore learned to offer silence rather than questions. Graves ensured no soldier interrogated them without Hart present. Even the cooks learned to set aside food gently, as though laying offerings at a shrine of wounded spirits. Then, one morning, word came that a series of repatriation vessels would soon depart from Lingane Gulf. Hart gathered the girls, explaining the process with calm precision. The news sparked mixed reactions: hope, fear, uncertainty. The youngest asked if they would still receive meals like the ones here. Another girl asked whether the nurses would accompany them. The oldest, after a long pause, asked what would happen to the list and documents. Graves answered that they would be preserved, secured, and delivered to Allied intelligence. Her lips trembled as she nodded, relief and grief blending like colors in a single stroke. On their final morning in camp, the cooks prepared a small batch of cheeseburgers for the departing column. Hart hesitated when offering one to the oldest girl, unsure whether the gesture might reopen old wounds. But the girl reached for it slowly, her hands steady. She took a bite, her eyes softening not with sorrow this time, but with recognition. A taste once haunted by fear had become something else, a marker of survival, a memory reclaimed rather than or found himself drawn to these changes. He visited when off duty, sitting cross-legged a respectful distance away, carving small wooden figures from scrap pieces of rations crates. He left them without ceremony, a bird, a tiny cup, a little bridge placing them on the girls' blankets. At first, they didn't touch them. Then one morning, Hart noticed the youngest turning the wooden bird in her hands, tracing its wings. Hart caught Whitmore's eye across the clearing and gave a grateful nod. He looked away quickly, embarrassed by how much it meant. The interpreters returned daily, guiding conversations that helped the girls articulate their needs and fears. Some asked about repatriation, when they might return to Korea, whether ships were safe, whether anyone would meet them at the ports. The oldest admitted she had no family left. She feared her homeland would not welcome her. The interpreters translated gently, their expressions heavy with understanding. Hart answered carefully, explaining that the Americans would ensure they reached a civilian protection center first, where they could decide their next steps. She never offered false promises, and the girls seemed to trust her more for it. One afternoon, a transport officer arrived to assess who might be fit enough for the coming evacuations. His clipboard, his brisk manner, his military certainty unsettled the girls. Hart saw their shoulders stiffen, the shadows creep back into their expressions. She stepped between the officer and the group, her tone still respectful but firm. She explained their medical conditions, their vulnerabilities, and the need for specialized care. The officer hesitated, assessing the nurse who stood before him with the posture of someone defending more than patience. Eventually, he nodded, agreeing to postpone decisions until the girls gained more strength. When he left, the girls leaned closer to Hart, as though she had shielded them from an encroaching storm. Recovery continued in slow, uneven waves. Some mornings the girls spoke freely. Some nights they woke crying from dreams endured. Whitmore noticed her expression and felt something shift inside him. A quiet understanding that healing didn't erase pain, it reshaped it. The girl finished the last bite, then handed him the small wooden bird he had carved earlier. She placed it in his palm with a faint bow, a gesture carrying more meaning than words. He closed his fingers around it, unsure how to respond, and she offered a small, almost invisible smile dot as the girls prepared to board the waiting convoy. Hart walked beside them, adjusting blankets, offering last reassurances. The eldest paused at the truck's edge, glancing back at Hart, then Graves, then Whitmore. Her gaze lingered on each of them, as if capturing the shapes of the people who had helped her re-enter her own life. Just before climbing aboard, she spoke softly to the interpreter, who relayed her words with quiet urgency. She remembered something else, something she had been too afraid to say before. It concerned another station, farther inland, one the Americans had not yet discovered. And if the map in her memory was right, she whispered, there were girls still alive there, waiting for someone to find them.